Recording in progress.
So how to take the video off?
Good evening, everybody, and as was mentioned, a good Chodesh Shabbos yesterday was Rosh Chodesh Menachemov, and as was mentioned, it was the yahrzeit of Reb Yitzchok Dubov Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, my Zayda, and it gives me great pleasure to share with you over the next 45 minutes history, zichronos, memories, a little bit of a walk down memory lane, a revisit to Manchester, New York, and perhaps different places in the world as well. Let me start off with the Dvar Torah. It says in Chumash, Sha'al avicha v'yageidcha zekeinecha v'yomru lach. Ask your father and he'll tell you, zekeinecha, your zayda, v'yomru lach, and he'll tell you as well. So it's interesting to note by Sha'al avicha, when you ask your father, it says v'yageidcha. Whereas zekeinecha, when it says Yozeda, it says v'yomru lach. Now, what is the difference between Haggadah and Amira? So you ladies are very familiar with that because it says in the Torah, Kosoma lebeis Yaakov v'sagid levnei Yisrael. You should say to the Beis Yaakov, which are the women, v'sagid, and tell the Bnei Yisrael. And Rashi says that the difference between Amira and Haggadah is Amira is B'loshen Raka. When you say something, you say it softly. But when you Haggadah, when you say it strong, Devarim Koshim Kegidim, words which are as strong as sinews, so those are strong words. So Kosoma lebeis Yaakov, to the women, he spoke softly. Kosoma lebeis Yaakov v'sagid lebnei Yisrael, the Bnei Yisrael spoke strongly. So I think the same you can say in the pasuk Sha'al avicha, when you ask your father v'yageidcha, he tells you strong. Fathers often say things strongly, have to be disciplinarians. Zekeinecha, when it comes to your zayda, v'yomru lach, it's b'amira raka. And certainly in my case, that was the case. I was 14 years old when my zayda passed away, Rosh Chodesh Menachemov Toshin Lamed Zayin, 1977. And I do remember him clearly. He was at my bar mitzvah. My bar mitzvah was Thursday morning in Seymour Road in Manchester Yeshiva. I got called up to the Torah in the presence of the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Segal, and the Zayda. And on Shabbos, Parshas B'Shalach, my bar mitzvah was in the Adas Yisrael. And it was a very beautiful occasion. And I remember clearly his Levaya, which was on Sunday, Beis Menachemov in Tovshin Lamed Zayin. So really, I'd like to share with you this evening a number of different aspects. First of all, to tell you a little bit about the person, but also to do so from a perspective of a grandchild. Why? To impress what impact certainly a Zayda can have, and in general, a Dugma Chaya can have on a person. In my case, that was very much the case. I had one great disadvantage, and that was I had a communication problem. My earliest recollections of the Zayda were the following. Then my family then lived in South Manchester. We lived in a place called Northern, and we used to visit my grandfather regularly. My father, Oliver Shalom, was Begashmias, his greatest supporter. I would say, of course, he was employed by the shul in the yeshiva, but the person who really took care of a lot of his physical needs was my father, Oliver Shalom. And so he would often go and visit the Zayda. So my earliest recollections were the visit in Darlington Street. And that was as a very, very small child. The only thing I can remember of Darlington Street was that the inner room had red divan, like a couch, where he used to sleep with a blanket, and a very old decrepit kitchen. As a child, I recall the toilet was right at the back of the garden, and there was no toilet paper. I think it was just the Manchester Gazette or something like. And there were mice running all over the place. And, just as a child, that's what I could remember of Darlington Street. Of course, he moved up in the world when he went to live on top of the Adas Yisrael shul. And there was an apartment on top of the shul. And the earliest memory I can remember of that was visiting him one Sukkot. And of course, the sukkah, as you go now into the shul, is just to the right, where the car park is. And I recall always going up the stairs and having the same question as I walked up the stairs. As you come in, as you know, in the Adas Yisrael, in the shul entrance, you turn left to go into the shul, and you go up to go to what was his apartment. So on the left there, going up, there was a beautiful picture. And as a child, I always had, every time I visited him, the same question. This is a beautiful picture of my Zayda, I thought. But it didn't exactly look like him. And then when I got to the top of the stairs and I looked at the Zayda, I always remember, I said, they're beautiful. Both of them are beautiful. But it doesn't look exactly the picture. I wonder when that picture was taken. It was only many years later that I came to understand that the picture at the bottom of the stairs was a picture of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the picture at the top of the stairs was the Zayda. But in my mind, as a child, the two became equated. And of course, later on in life, of course, when I got to know him more, and we had this communication problem because he couldn't speak English. Silly, not enough English to communicate with me properly, and I couldn't speak Yiddish. And so the earliest communications was through a very dribbly kiss, which, like as a child when you would approach this long, white, dribbly beard, it was something with great trepidation, and it left quite a mark on your face. But it was all worth it because the auntie, we used to call her auntie, his second wife, in fact, used to make the most fantastic gefilte fish. Heavenly, I have never today tasted such good gefilte fish as her. And I knew as a child that if you got the kiss, you got the gefilte fish. So it was definitely worth it. And of course, when he passed away, she lived in the apartment. She lived almost a year after he passed away. She passed away, in fact, Gimel Tammuz, a year later. So it was just a few weeks short of his first Yortzeit. His first wife, in fact, was called Zlata, the Baba Zlata, that was my father's mother. And she actually passed away just before the Second World War. She was buried, or is buried, in Whitefield, in Phillips Park. And her father was called Nissen David, and hence I'm a name after him. Interesting, I never knew what her mother was called. On her grave, it's written her name, Zlata Bas Reb Nissen David, but I never knew what her mother was called. Her surname was Swerdlov, and they came from a town called Luzki in Vilna. I know that because one of the things which I did inherit from my Zayda was his Shas. This is a very beautiful Shas, which in fact he carried out, believe it or not, as I'll tell you the story soon, from Russia when he went to Riga. And it's a Vilna Shas. And as you can see over here, it in fact was his father-in-law's. He was actually called Chaim Nissen David Sverdlov, who was a sheikhet in the town of Luzki, Plach, Vilna. Anyway, my Zayda had 9 children, 4 boys and 5 girls. In fact, I saw over here Chavi Wiener, one of the oldest boys. The oldest boy was Zalman Yosef, who is Chavi Wiener's father. There was a boy called Shalom. Unfortunately, he was killed in Tels by the Nazis, Yimach Shemam. Then there was my father, Oliver Shalom, and then my uncle had an uncle Label who went to live in New York. And that, in fact, is important to remember soon in the story, because his chasna, as we'll soon tell you, was Zayin Shvat Tov Yud. Just pop that in your memory. We'll come back to that in a minute. So actually, Chavi Wiener, who is my cousin, who I believe is on, she is the daughter of Zalman Yosef Aloni. He had to change his name. Dubov in Russian means an oak tree. Alon in Hebrew means a tree. So they changed it from Dubov to Aloni. And the other girls, quite a number of the other girls, there were 5 girls. There was Hannah, Brenda, Rochel. They actually got stuck in Russia and eventually made it through the Haganah and the Palmach, whatever, to Eretz Yisrael. And 2 of children were actually born in England. Sarah Maslow, she actually lived in Stamford Hill, Barry Avenue. She was the mikveh lady in Stamford Hill. And the youngest was called Leah Reichman, and all her children live. You probably, somebody, perhaps the old timers remember Aman Zilela. She originally lived in Manchester, but then moved to London, and there's a big family down here in London. So, in fact, his first wife, the Baba Zlata, was a great tzaddikas, and my father was very, very attached to her. And it was a great blow, of course, when she passed away when he was so young. He remembers that when she was ill, I heard this also from Sammy Brazil, who I believe is it Mrs. Goodman's father, Reb Shmuel, that when she was ill, she was in hospital, and she asked Reb Shmuel to call for Rabbonim. And they thought that she was going to say vidui and pass away. In fact, she called Rabbonim, and she was mataneda because she used to fast every Monday and Thursday. And since she felt she couldn't fast anymore, she was mataneda then. This I heard from Rav Shmuel Brazil. She was a great tzaddikas. So let's go back to the Zayda. Where was he born? Where did he come from? How did he get to Manchester, and how did he have such a tremendous impact on the Manchester community? So let's go back all the way to the beginning. He was actually born on Zayin Menachem Av in the year 1886, and he was born in the town called Yakshitz. Now, I only know that town because Reb Mendel Futterfass have a lovely picture of the two sitting together. It's not a very clear picture, but those who can recognize it, you can see it. There you've got the Zeder and Reb Mendel sitting together. He used to call him Itche Yakshitzer. And of course that was from the town that he came from. And it was near Bobroisk, and his father was called Avram Dovber. In fact, that was the name of my father, so the Zayda gave it over to the grandchild, and he was a chassid of the Rebbe Marash. So his parents, which was Rebbe Avram Dovber, and his mother, who was called Dvosha, actually dropped him off at the age of 12, believe it or not, in the Cheder in Lubavitch. Now, the yeshiva in Lubavitch was Miyusid and Tafresh Nun Zayin and Tafresh Nun Tes. It was given the name Tomchei Tmimim, and he was from the first students in the yeshiva of Tomchei Tmimim. In fact, the Frierdiker Rebbe refers to him in a letter as Mibachirei Tomchei Tmimim. He was one of the great, choicest students in Tomchei Tmimim, and he was also a great Balmanagin. He had a very good voice and he sang Nigunim. Again, one of my great memories of him, I used to go every Shalosh Shudas to the Adas Yisrael, And it was very beautiful to watch him, even in his elderly years, singing B'nei Heichala by Shalosh Shudas, and eating the herring, which must have been at least 4,000 years old, which they served in the Adas then. It was good old, I think it was Oscar, who used to serve it? I guess in the Norman. But he had laser... Grunsfeld, thank you. And you had Laser Klein there, and Scheftel, and you had Charlie, and I had them all lined up, all the Kleins and so on and so forth. And it was so nice to just to sit there and hear Altach Sidische Nigunim, and the Zayru would go, Yoch, da 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 da, and just to hear it, to see it, it's still very, very fresh in my memory. So he got married in 1911 to, as I said, to Zlata Sverdlov. She was the daughter of Chaim Nissen David, or Nissen David Sverdlov. And I mentioned to you, I didn't know what his wife was called. I once was in New York, and I was speaking to my uncle, and just, it fell into my head to ask him, you wouldn't by any chance know what is the name of the Baba Zlata's mother? He said, of course I know. I mean, after all, it was his grandmother. He said she was called Sarah. Now, those who know, I'm married to a lady called Sarah. And so I actually got quite a shock. It was quite fascinating that Nissen David and Sarah, 4 generations later, just repeated itself. The first place he was sent to on Shlichus was a town called Penza, which was southeast of Moscow, and it was a town for refugees. There were, in the war, First World War, over 6,000 refugees in this town, and they didn't have a Rav, and he was appointed to be the Rav. The problem is that he went through the Russian Revolution, and then, of course, they came in the communists, and there was a Rosh Ha'ir, a Jewish head of the community, who really was a informer for the KGB, and he gave the Zayda a very hard time. And on one occasion, by the Shechita, he brought him a stomach of a cow, and he asked him if it's kosher or treif. The Zayda had a look at it and said it was treif. And the man said, yeah, but, we need you to say it's kosher. The Zayda would not give in, and eventually what happened is the KGB came to arrest him. And he had to flee with his family at an instant's notice, and he traveled over 1,000 kilometers to get to Rostov, which was where the Rebbe was at the time. In fact, the Rebbe's Stern Sarah, when she saw him, she was aghast to see him in such a terrible situation. But nevertheless, when she told the Rebbe Rashab what had happened, the Rebbe Rashab was happy with his Mesiras Nefesh. He then moved back to a different town called Pandel for a short while, and he was involved over there in trying to extract Jewish soldiers from the army. However, he realized that he had to leave the country because he had to jump the border because they were going to imprison him. And miraculously, I heard the story how he got out from my uncle on a wagon in the middle of the night, that he managed to get out into Latvia. And he was appointed in Riga, the Rav of the Kehillah. And in Riga he had a prestigious position. He was the Rav of the Chassidish Kehillah. It was not far from the town of Dvinsk. Now, those who know, in the town of Dvinsk, there were 2 Kehillahs, a Kehillah of Chassidim and a Kehillah of Misnagdim. The Kehillah of Chassidim, the Rav was the Rogatchover Goin, Rabbi Yosef Rosen. And the Rav of the Misnagdim was called Reb Meir Simcha, the Or Sameach. The Zayda, because he was a Rav in Riga, he often met up with the Rogatchover. And he spoke with him in learning. In fact, he received smicha from the Rogatchover, which was a tremendous thing at the time. In 1927, as you know the story, the Frierdiker Rebbe had to leave Russia after the story of Yud Beis Tammuz. However, what is not well known is that he could only leave to a country and to a place that would give him a work visa. Reb Yitzchok Dubov was a member of the Latvian parliament, and together with my Zayda worked very hard to provide the papers in order to allow the Frierdiker Rebbe to come to Riga. In fact, my Zayda, as far as I understand, gave up his position as the official Rav of the community in order to give that position over to the Frierdiker Rebbe so that he should have the correct papers. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe arrived in Riga, it was a tremendous, tremendous event, certainly for him. And I believe the story goes that he brought 100 Talmidim to the Frierdiker Rebbe, saying to him that these are the people who he had hashpah on, he had influence on. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, "Is this all you did in Riga, just to bring 100 Talmidim?" Anyway, the story goes that the Frierdiker Rebbe very much wanted the Rogatchover to be involved in a certain Vad Hatzalah of the Russian jury, and he asked my Zayda very much to get the Rogatchover to come to Riga and be involved. It actually took place, it happened, although the Rogatchover didn't used to get involved much in Askonas Siburis, but there was an occasion under one roof that the Zayda sat in the room with the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rogatchover, and a young man called the Ramash. Now that, we all know who that is. And he was very, of course, taken by this smart young man whom he got to know as a person who was a Boki, B'chol Chadrei Torah, who was knowledgeable in all areas of the Torah, Nigla and Nista, and was just bowled over by him. The Zayda had to move on though, and he had an offer of a position in Manchester, and in 1927-28 he moved. Only 6 months later did his wife and children come. I had an interesting personal episode. The very first time I went to 770, I met Rabbi Chadakov, Oliver Shalom. And he was a very smart cookie indeed. And he asked me, Wie heißt du? What's your name? So I said, Dubov. He said, Wie heißt dein Tata? What's your father's name? So I said to him, he was born in Riga, but probably you don't remember him, because my father was 4 years old when he left Riga. So he looked at me very piercingly, and he said, Wie heißt dein Tata? What's your father's name? So I told him his name. He said, I remember him. I thought, oh my goodness. Anyway, apparently, the Baba took all the children into a Yechidus with the Frierdiker Rebbe before they left. But what is fascinating was, before the Zayda left Riga, he went into Yechidus with the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe said to him, Mevetzach nochmal zen, we'll see each other again. Which for him was a tremendous piece of news. Nobody, of course, knew in 1927 what was going to transpire in history. Nevertheless, he was happy to hear from the Frierdiker Rebbe that they were going to see each other again. He traveled to Manchester, and in Manchester started working in Manchester Yeshiva and being Mamid Talmidim. Manchester Yeshiva Seymour Road itself, well, then the Yeshiva was in Seymour Road, was a project of 50 years for the Zayda. Lo yamush mitoch ha'ohel, day in, day out, go to the yeshiva. I recall, would sit every morning, learn Likutei Torah, Torah Or, would daven. He was a tzir for the Bachrim. In Misnagdish yeshivas, they called him a mashkiach. By us, we call him a mashpia. He was the mashpia. The Rosh Hashiva was a big misnagid. He was the Rosh Hashiva. But the harmony which they lived together was phenomenal. They learned together every single day. Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Brura, they had a chavrusa every single day. And the Bachrim who learned there went through the yeshiva. Of course, there were no Lubavitcher yeshivas at the time. So the Shem Tovs, Rebbetzin Shem Tov by that time had come. So Beryl Shem Tov and had came to learn in Manchester. Mezeda who had Hashpah. The people in Manchester who you know, you're talking about Shalom Weiss and Barry Lent and the Vogels. All these were people who learnt in Manchester Yeshiva, and the Zayda had tremendous hashpah. Over the 50 years, I think it's fair to say that thousands and thousands and thousands of Bachrim who went through Manchester Yeshiva were influenced by the Zayda. Of course, especially on the Yom de Pagra, he would give a Shir Tanya in the Yeshiva every single day, and Yutes Kislev was his Yom Tov. He would fabring in the Yeshiva. And it was a tzir. Here you had a misnagdish yeshiva with a chsidish yid, a mashpia. It was a very beautiful thing. I have letters, many letters of the Rebbe to the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe to the Zayda. In them, the Rebbe would write the names of all the Talmidim to the Rebbe in his pan. Fascinating. And the Rebbe would answer in a letter with all the names, l'chvoid, and it would have all the names of the Talmidim. And sometimes the Rosh Yeshiva himself would write to the Rebbe. The Rebbe would give the Rosh Yeshiva hadracha how to deal sometimes with difficult Talmidim, and so on and so forth. So Manchester Yeshiva itself, I think, it's fair enough to say that the Zayda sitting and learning Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, Marsha, Pnei Yehoshua, those were his famous Mefarshim, giving a shir in Tanya, giving a shir in Likutei Torah, learning with Bachrim, that was his life. Of course, outside that, you had the Adas Yisrael, the Shul. I believe that he gave a weekly shir in Kal Chsidim and 62 Singleton Road in the later years. And in general, he was the Elter Chassid in Manchester. And I think in the older generation in London, certainly, those who went to Manchester Yeshiva, all of whom were tremendously inspired by him. So, Hamida Talmidim Harbe, he certainly fulfilled that tremendously. At the same time, that's the yeshiva life. The home life was in great poverty. Of course, he lost his first wife, he remarried, and the children were scattered all around the place. It really wasn't easy. Some children in Russia, then Israel. My uncle Zalman ended up in Dublin. My father was drafted into the Royal Air Force. It was wartime then, and then came back after quite a number of years fighting. And it was, in general, it was a difficult situation. But I want to fast forward to 1950. In 1950, it was just after the war, Label Dubov, who was the youngest boy, had gone to learn in 770. And he was engaged to be married on Zayin Shvat, Tov Shin Yud. And the Zayda decided, Imloi Achshav Emasai, he must go. And so he took that journey, and he ended up being one of the very last people to go into Yechidus with the Frierdiker Rebbe. Because the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away that Shabbos, Yud Shvat. And in that Yechidus, the Zayda felt already that there was a hint about the Histalkus. Of course, the Masada Kedushin at the Chasana was the Rebbe, the Rashag, the beautiful picture of the Rebbe sitting next to the Chasana and the Zayda and the Rashag, all of whom were there. And then, boom, on Shabbos, the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. So you can imagine, on one hand, he was tremendously in shock. Although it was an unbelievable fulfillment of a nevuah of the Frierdiker Rebbe who said they will see each other again. The Frierdiker Rebbe had said that in Riga, and it was actually fulfilled in his seeing him again in New York, just shortly before he passed away. The Zayda knew, however, that V'zarach Hashemesh Uba Hashemesh, that the sun sets, but the sun rises. Although the Frierdiker Rebbe had passed away, he was absolutely sure, because he had had this connection with the Ramash in Riga, that he was the one that should take over. And immediately in the Shiva, he went over to him and he said to him that he should take on the Nasias. And the Rebbe really pushed him away, if one could say so. And he actually says, what? He said his own name, Mem Shina Rebbe, like, are you crazy? And the Zayda wasn't having anything of it. He knew that this was, he knew that he had to exert pressure, and he kept a very close eye on him. One day during the Shiva, the Zayda was watching the Rebbe very closely, and he saw three strange things, which seemingly were strange. Number one, he noticed at the end of davening, the Rebbe under the talus was doing something with his tefillin. And he was thinking, usually most people, they finish putting Rashi on, put on Rabbeinu Tams, and that's it. But he's not. He's under the talus doing who knows what. The second thing he noticed, that when we daven Shemona Esrei, we clap, Slach Lanu Avinu. We clap twice in Shemona Esrei. And the Rebbe didn't. He thought that's strange. Doesn't seem to have a source in Shulchan Aruch. And the third thing, he noticed that by the end of davening, just before the Kaddish de Rabbanon, after saying Rebbe Chananim and Akasha Omer, the Rebbe went like this. He was Ma'ava Yodai al Mitzchay, and he said a few words, and then he said Kaddish. After davening, the Rebbe sat down on a bench, and the Zayda sat down, and the Rebbe said that although we don't say by Chsidim Hespedim, however we tell Sipurim. And the Rebbe said that the Frierdiker Rebbe had instructed him to lay 4 pairs of tefillin and had given him a seder of how to do it. So the Zayda heard already the answer to his first question. What was he doing under the talus? He was removing the tefillin of Rashi, and there's a whole seder how to put on the Rebbe Nutan's, the Shemusha Rab, and the Raivet. And then he said, on days we do not say Tachanun, or at a time that you don't say Tachanun, you don't bang Slach Lanu by Shemona Esrei. And then he said that the Frierdiker Rebbe instructed him that before he says Rebbe Chananya, the Kaddish the Rabbanon after davening, he should wipe his hand over his forehead and say a line of Tanya. And this line of Tanya, the Yodei Dova, those who know, the Rebbe said the opening line of Perek Beis of Tanya v'Nefesh Hashenis b'Yisrael. So the Zayda saw Ruach HaKodesh. Here he was standing near the Rebbe. He didn't say a word. He had 3 questions in his head, and immediately the Rebbe had answered these questions. And so he immediately, even before he left Tu B'Shvat, then Yud Shvat, he again strongly tried to impress upon the Rebbe that the Rebbe should take the Nasias, but the Rebbe resisted. As soon as he got back to England, the first person he went to was Rebbe Nsian Shem Tov in London, and he impressed upon him that he should write immediately a Ksav his Kashrus to the Rebbe, which he did, and the Rebbe Nsian wrote Kvoi Kedushas Admur Shlita, which is what you would write to a Rebbe. And within a few weeks, many Chassidim, both in England and in Eretz Yisrael, in Europe, were writing to the Rebbe. My Zayda worked very, very hard to encourage Chassidim that they should write to the Rebbe in a way that he was going to accept the Nasias. The Rebbe, one of the things which the Rebbe said to the Zayda was that he didn't have a Hirah. He didn't have a Hirah, which means he hadn't heard from the Frierdiker Rebbe that. if there's a beautiful sefer called Yemei Bereshis, if you read it, it goes and tells of this whole episode of the first year, and of course it culminated, as you all know, on Yud Shvat Tovshin Yud Aleph, when at the Farbrengen it was another Manchester connection, a chassid called Reb Sender Nemtsov, who actually stood on the table and said, it's all good and fine to hear sichas, however we want to hear a maimer, because the Rebbe says a maimer, and it was then that the Rebbe started saying the maimer Basi Legani. And of course, he made a bracha Shechianu, and Baruch Hashem, they had a Rebbe. Later on, as you know, Mr. Zalman Jaffe, Oliver Shalom, arranged many trips, and I'm not going to go over my encounters with the Rebbe, beautiful, beautiful diaries of the trips in his own beautiful style. Reb Zalman writes how everybody went, and of course there was the famous trip from Manchester, and I'll just say over 3 short stories from once on Simchas Torah, Tovshin Chaf Aleph, the Zayda was there in New York. Now he was a Baal Menagen, so it was Simchas Torah, and the Rebbe said that he's going to make a competition. He's going to make a competition between different countries. So America would be represented by Reb Shmuel Zalmanov. He was the chassid who the Frierdiker Rebbe had instructed already to write the Nichoyach, and eventually came out, the Book of Nigunim. Then there was a chassid called Reb Shmuel Betzalel Altois. He was going to represent Australia. And Reb Yitzchok Dubov would represent England. Each one would sing a nigun and would see who would win. This was Simchas Torah Tovshin Chaf Aleph. When it came to the Zayda's turn to sing, it appears he'd had a little bit of l'chaim. So before he got up, he stood up and he said, America will for sure win because the Rebbe's in America. And he sat down, and the Rebbe smiled, and then he said, okay, let's hear the nigun, and he sang the, I actually know the nigun, which he sang at that Farbrengen. In Tovshin Chav Zayin, an interesting episode, remember he passed away in Tovshin Lamed Zayin 1977, so in 1967, he was there, and he was there in Chodesh Av. And his birthday, as we mentioned, was Zayin Av. So he came up to the Rebbe and he said, Es wird sein Shnas Hashmoinim Divach. This week, he passed away in 1977, and this happened in 1967. He went to the Rebbe and he said that this week is going to be my 80th birthday. So the Rebbe said to him, Zol sein zum Shnas Hatishim, that it should be till your 90th birthday. And that's exactly what happened, that 10 years later, he passed away. On his passport, he was 106 years old. I have the passports. An interesting Russian passport. I think it was fast-forwarded. Your age is fast-forward because of the army, whatever. So it's not the exact age, but that was the Maisa. The last time he was by the Rebbe was in Tovshin Lamed Hey in 1975. He was getting on then. As well, according to that account of his age, he was 88 years old. And he would never allow himself to sit down in Yechidus. The Rebbe would always ask him to sit down, and he always refused. Then he was very sick. It was very difficult for him. So the Rebbe pleaded with him to sit down, and he refused. So the Rebbe said that if that being the case, at least he should lean on the table. So he put his hands on the table to support himself, and in the Yechidus. And in that Yechidus, he said to the Rebbe that Ir seid doch Melech HaMashiach seid nisgale. You are the Melech HaMashiach, you should reveal yourself. So the Rebbe said to him, Oif mir is kein manianit. I don't have a problem. Aber, and the Rebbe didn't finish. In other words, the Rebbe said, I'm ready. But, and the rest of the sentence is a number of dots. In other words, it's up to the Chassidim and up to the rest of the world to get themselves ready for Mashiach. There's a lot more to tell. There's a lot more to tell. I'll just say one more thing and then I'll stop. Before he passed away, he said that he's not sure, what's going to be when he goes Lamaila, but he has two zechuyos. He has two merits. Merit number one was that he helped in the rescue effort of the Frierdiker Rebbe to extract the Frierdiker Rebbe from Russia with Reb Yitzchok Dubov. And the second merit, that he was at the head of the effort to appoint the Rebbe as the Rebbe. There was another merit which he had, which was in 1952, when the Rebbe's brother, Rabbi Yisrael Aryeh passed away. And then Reb Yitzchok Shem Tov came from London to Manchester. The Zayda was giving a shir at the time, and Reb Yitzchok came in and told him what had happened. And the Zayda took 10 Bacharim and of course went to Liverpool and took care, together with Reb Yitzchok and others, of the Vaching and then the transport to the airport to take him to Tzfas, of course, where he's actually buried in Tzfas. And he received a special letter of thanks from the Rebbe for doing this. Of course, the Bacharim didn't really know who it was because his name was Gurari. In other words, the name of Reb Yisrael Aryeh officially on the documents was Gurari, so they didn't actually link it with it being. But however, Reb Yitzchok and of course the Zayda knew. I'll just finish with a very nice short episode with Reb Yitzchok and Shem Tov. They say Manchester Yeshiva, as I mentioned beforehand, was a Misnagdische Yeshiva, Litvische Yeshiva. And of course, it says in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that one shouldn't kiss in a shul. The only thing you kiss in a shul is a Sefer Torah. So once Reb Yitzchok came in to Manchester Yeshiva, and the two good friends saw each other, and of course they gave each other a hug and a kiss. So later on, the Bacharim came up and they said, Rabbi Dubov, doesn't it say in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that you shouldn't kiss in a shul? So the Zayda said, a Sefer Torah megman kushan. He said, a Sefer Torah you're allowed to kiss. He said, Reb Yitzchok is a walking Sefer Torah. That warmth, that chassidische Warmkeit, that beautiful combination between Mesiras Nefesh and Simchas HaChayim and Nigle, Chassidus, and Sipurim, Nigunim, that all came together in one great Chassidish Yid who's buried in Rainsow Cemetery. On his right is Rebbe Rivkin, upon whose matzeva it's written Baki B'Shas Al Adaf. Unfortunately, when there was the fire in the yeshiva and the Sifrei Torah were burned, the remnants of the Sifrei Torah are buried next to Rebbe Rivkin. So you have Rebbe Rivkin, and then you have Mazeda, and then you have Shnei Zalman Klein, and so on and so forth. The Tmimim are all together there. And that's part of Manchester's history, really. I'm still glad to see when I walk into the Adas that the marble is still on the wall. It says the Rabbi is Reb Yitzchok Dubov and it says the trustees, I think, all the clients, I can't remember exactly who it was over there, but that's still there till today. And I think on one level, the Zayda's influence still carries on through the Talmidim, and of course through the extended families. So this huge family, Baruch Hashem, those 9 children, has tributaries, many grandchildren, great-grandchildren, of course, all of whom all over the world. Some of them I'm here, but of the family, you've got, as I said beforehand, as I noted in the chat, you've got some of the Reichmans in London, the Maslows, those who know them, the Wieners, the Alonis, and you've got the Dubovs in Princeton, in Orlando, all over America, and many in Eretz Yisrael. Shakavitsky, and Kanainahara, a large family. Yehi Zichrei Baruch. His memory should be for a blessing. He should have a lichtige Gan Eden. His neshama should have an aliyah. And of course, what is poignant is that he passed away on the yahrzeit of Aaron HaKohen, who was Oyev Sabrias and Makarvan La Torah. And one could say the same of the Zayda. He was Oyev Sabrias, he loved people, he was Makar of them to the Torah. People didn't really have a bad word to say. He was Mu'urav and Mabrias, he got on with everybody in the community. The synergy in the yeshiva itself was very beautiful to see, of people of different backgrounds but living in great respect to each other. It is really fantastic to live in that aura. And I think the most important thing for me personally was just to see a dugma chaya, just to see, even though I didn't really understand it at the time, I was a child at the time, but I knew I was seeing something. And that, of course, is a tremendous lesson to each one of us. And I think a takeaway for each one of us. The impact that a Baba and a Zayda can have, a teacher, a parent, a dugma chaya. You never know, even if you are completely unaware. But if you say a bracha with kavana, if you daven with kavana, if you dress with tznius, those who are watching you may not be your own children. It could be a complete stranger. But somebody notices it and gets inspired by it, could even live their whole life off that inspiration, and you will never know about it. I had once an occasion, I was on Mivtzoim in Manhattan, and I saw a Jew walk down the road. I could see he was Jewish because, well, he looked Jewish. And I walked up to him, I said, "Excuse me, sir, did you have a chance to put tefillin on today?" I didn't even ask him if he was Jewish. He looked too Jewish. See, he screamed at me. He says, "No!" And he walked off. And he did it with such force, it was like punching me in the face. I got so taken aback. I retreated into the mitzvah tank. I had to be treated by first aid vodka. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've offended somebody. And 3 months later, I was on Mivtzoim in exactly the same place. And I saw him coming down the road. Manhattan is blessed with very wide boulevards. So I decided, once burnt, twice shy, I'm going to cross the road. So I crossed the road, but I noticed he's making a beeline for me. And I thought, oh, Gewalt, he's going to give me another chelik now. So I thought, the British element inside me popped up, and I thought, if I'm going to go down, I might as well go down fighting. So I plucked up the courage and I said to him, "No, would you like to put tefillin on now?" He said, "I've been looking for you." And I thought, okay, come on, let's have it already. And he said, "I've been looking for you because I wanted to thank you." So I said, "Excuse me, what did you say?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you the one that asked me to put tefillin on 3 months ago and I shouted at you?" I said, "No." I said, "Yes." He said, "You should know I walked away from you and I couldn't work out in the life of me, why did I shout at you? What had you done wrong? I know you guys are your Lubavitchers, that's what you do, you ask people to... Why did I shout at you?" And I was so bothered by the fact I was brought up in a modern Orthodox family for a year after my bar mitzvah, I laid tefillin, and then I lapsed. He said, when I got home, I was so bothered I put tefillin on. And I want to tell you, every single day since then, I've been laying tefillin. And I said to myself, Ribono Shel Olam, I could never have met that person again in my life. and I would still be under the impression that there's somebody out there who I really annoyed. And Hashem b'chesed elyon showed me that that's not necessarily the case. You never know. You drop a pebble in a pond, and where the ripples go, you have no idea. But in terms of setting a dugma chaya, in terms of being a tziyur to the younger generation, for me, that tziyur, whom I have his picture in my dining room, that beautiful picture which was on the flyer with the candles, that's actually at a chasna. I have that picture, and every single day, that tziyur of the Zayda, of my Zayda, is still in front of my eyes and has tremendous hashpah on me today. Yehei zichrei baruch, v'hikitzer anu sheichnei ofar. May all those tamimim get up and come and dance together with all of us to greet Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Karev Mamash.